Welcome, everybody, to the convention history panel. Let me go back to the first slide again, to the convention history panel. So if you guys don't know, I've been doing a panel on the history of conventions for the last few years at a bunch of different cons. I've been researching the history of fan-run conventions for a little bit about a decade now, probably since about 2013. I've been working on a book covering the topic because it combines a lot of stuff that I'm very interested in. So if you guys don't know a little bit of background about me, you guys might know me as Chocolate Pony in the Pony fandom. I'm also under different aliases like Transformative and South Park Dallas in different fandoms. My background comes from my different forms of education. I went to military academy where I was a cadet officer. There, I studied a lot of leadership theory and organizational management. So the organizational side of me, where I like looking at the organizations and structure of cons, comes from my military academy background. From Johns Hopkins University, I studied evolutionary biology, and I also studied psychology. So those two fields kind of help make me look at the evolution of fandoms and conventions from a different sense, more from the psychological angle of how different fandoms and groups appeal to people, and from the evolutionary biology perspective, treating the evolution of fandoms and conventions as if they were an evolutionary tree. So if you guys seen some of my early charts I've done at cons, I kind of try to map out this evolutionary timeline of these different cons. So since this is a special panel, I've done various versions of this panel at different cons, but since this is a special type of convention, I want to go into a little more detail behind my research process in researching the conventions and focus on different aspects of different conventions. So when I talk about conventions, I'm going to put forth, I'm specifically talking about pop culture conventions that are based on narrative art. Narrative art specifically means comics, literature, film, television, visual novels, animations, and video games to a lesser extent. We're going to look at the process of how they kind of came about, how they evolved, and then we're going to bring it up to the modern time where I'm going to be joined by Simo, and he's going to help cover the history of the Brony fandom with me. And then we're going to go back to looking at the current period and seeing how all these things wound up with the coronavirus. So we're going to kind of look at that. So to prepare for the panel, I wanted to redo this specific slide. So I basically I try to make a cleaner looking chart that's easier for people to look at. And see kind of how the different cons came about. So this is a little bit cleaner chart, still kind of rough, but it kind of gives you a brief overview of the different cons and how I wanted to look at them. So specifically, we're going to be looking at the two branches right here. So we have WorldCon, which starts this branch of the science fiction cons. And then we have New York Comic Con, which starts the branch of the comic type conventions. And then basically every single type of convention you see afterwards, the furry cons, the anime cons, the pony cons, the trek cons, you could really see are some type of combination between these two different branches. And we're going to basically wind up to the modern day where we're going to be seeing all these different types of cons. And you can see some of the cons are color coded because we do have the eventual evolution of con groups like Left Field Media, Repop, Wizard Entertainment that either start making their own cons or founding cons and or taking over and buying cons, and that kind of moves us to what's called the pro con era where cons are now professionally run. So let's start about that. So I'm going to quickly go over some chapters that don't have too much information on cons, but kind of bring you back to what I'm talking about. So this is a book I'm writing on the topic of fan-run conventions. So first of all, what's a convention? It's a tricky definition to nail down because does that include trade shows? Does that include Renaissance fairs? If we include Renaissance fairs, does that include, let's say, Civil War reenactments? So there's a very, very broad range of what you could say is a convention. So I'm going to just narrow it down to like I was talking about. Narrative art fan conventions are specifically for science fiction, comics, anime, literature, and basically everything in between. To a lesser extent, we're going to talk about video games. So we're going to look at that. That's going to be the definition of the cons. Second, I'm going to be the book introduces the concept of what fandom is. So while this book is purely about conventions, I realize I cannot talk about conventions in an isolated situation. To talk about conventions, I have to talk about the environment around it. So because of this, I am approaching this from a holistic standpoint, which is kind of good because this is so if you guys don't know, I previously wrote two other books. I wrote a book on the Japanese visual novel industry, and I wrote a book on the history of military academies in America. And what's interesting about them is this was the first time those two topics have ever been touched on. So I kind of had to be the pioneer and look at stretches of time, coin different time periods, categorize everything. And I'm seeing the same thing for cons because there's never actually been a book written on the history of conventions. Different fandoms have cataloged their own conventions. Different fandoms have wrote about their own history, but conventions were not always the main prominent point of it. So by going through this book, I had to basically look at the history surrounding the convention scene itself, and thus I'm basically approaching this from a holistic point of view. Because of that, I'm also looking at primary sources. I'm not looking at secondary sources. So I know there's a lot of fandom psychology or fandom history research studies and books out there. I do sometimes find such things somewhat tainted because they're coming in from a bias of as a fan. So I'm trying to approach this as I approach my previous history books from a neutral standpoint, researching this topic as if it's the first time anyone has been approaching it and looking at it from a holistic standpoint. And one of the main things I really want to discuss is the purpose of fandom, because we think of fandom as a relatively recent thing, when in reality, the concept of fans and fandom has been something that's basically essential with human civilization. Our very first art, our very first stories were told by the local shaman. So every single culture has had their own shaman. The shaman would preserve stories that were important to their people that would need to be passed down from generation to generation. Each generation of shamans will pass down their story to another shaman. Each shaman would add to that story. They sometimes would add their own headcanon or add their own twist to that story. So you kind of see that ever since the start of the narrative art of stories, we've seen the idea of fanfics being written over them and people adding and twisting their own things on top of it. So the first chapter will talk about the history of fandom and fan fiction. The second chapter will talk about the fandoms at the turn of the century. So specifically, I'm going to look at what a lot of people consider as the modern fandoms, the fandoms of the Victorian era, when culture became popular. So we hear this a lot. We hear the concept of pop culture. What is pop culture? Well, it's essentially that, culture that's popular. So if we look throughout history, a lot of the stories were reserved only for the aristocrats, for the higher class, because it was only the rulers and the kings who could afford to commission plays and operas. They were the only ones who could commission artwork. They were the only ones who could afford to buy a handwritten book. They were the only ones who had time enough to read. So for a lot of history, unless it was oral history or oral storytelling, most stories and art were reserved for the upper class. It wasn't until printing became more accessible and cheaper around the time of the Victorian era and the Industrial Revolution that we started to see the middle class now having access to this culture. And one of the first authors that really appealed to the middle class was Jane Austen. You could kind of see Jane Austen fans as being the part of the original fan groups. You could see fans formed around Jane Austen's stories, and now the middle class has access to that. And then when we come to the pulp era, when printing became even much cheaper, then we had access to the lower classes. Now they had access to the stories and the comics, and eventually film, television, and radio. And thus, this is where we're talking about culture becoming popular. And I'm going to cover a little bit more about this. I cover this in different topics, so you could probably see one of my other panels on the history of this. But I really want to go straight into the conventions, and that's where we're going to start. We're going to start at chapter 3, where we really get to the first convention, the first modern convention, what people consider the first modern convention. Now, I want to first look at and explain the culture of where these conventions kind of born from. So we're looking at the 1930s. The 1930s is a period that is just coming out of the Great Depression. It's on the tail end of the Great Depression. So during the Great Depression, culture changed a bit in the fact that money was no longer accessible to people, and now you had to now when money was not accessible to as much people, now money is slowly trickling in. So now people are having a little extra spending money. Another thing that the Great Depression changed was the auto industry. So cars were seen as an expensive luxury. A lot of people couldn't afford cars. A lot of people couldn't afford gas. As the Great Depression ended, people could now start affording cars, and now they had a little bit leisure time. So with the access of cars and leisure time, they were able to do a lot of road trips. This is where a lot of the scenic routes started developing around this time. Two other important movements that happened around this time was we had World War One and we had the Spanish flu. So in the midst of the Spanish flu and World War One, where people were seeing death all over the place, we had a shift in a lot of our narrative storytelling. So we started seeing a shift in storytelling that entered one or two ways. One, we had a lot of stories that became more escapist. People just came out of a period of war and plague. So escapist fiction is something that would appeal to a lot of people. Two, you had the concept of modernism. So James Joyce, T.S. Eliot, Virginia Woolf, creating stories that were subverting all the stuff and experiences of the Great War and the Spanish Plague that came before them. And in the midst of this culture, we had what is widely considered the start of the golden age of science fiction. So 1938 is widely considered the start of the science fiction golden age. This is when John Campbell became the editor of one of the main pulp magazines around this time and brought on a lot of authors that would kind of become the main face of science fiction. So Asimov, Heinlein, even L. Ron Hubbard, all these great science fiction authors around this time contributed to what's now known as golden age of science fiction. Conversely, around the same time, you had Superman being published with Action Comics #1 the exact same year. So we have what's widely considered the birth of both the superhero genre, the golden age of superheroes, and the golden age of science fiction. So this is the period where we kind of seeing the first cons start forming. So there are a lot of cons that want to claim that they were the first cons. So there's a lot of small meetups. There is one in Philadelphia, the first Eastern science fiction convention, and there were some in London as well. So we had a lot of little meetups, but a lot of these quote unquote early conventions were more or less one-day meetups. They were more fan meetings of just people from out of town. The first con that's widely considered what we now known as the mainstream science fiction is the World Science Fiction Convention, also known as WorldCon. So there are specific elements of why WorldCon is widely considered the first convention. First, as opposed to a one-day meetup, it was held over the course of a weekend. So July 4th weekend in 1939 is when WorldCon was held. So as opposed to people coming from out of town to go to a one-day meetup and then either go back home or go to a different hotel, this was a convention that was specifically held in the hotel over the course of a weekend for people to go. It had about 200 guests, and they had the first guest of honor. They invited one of the science fiction authors to be the guest of honor, and also invited a lot of guests from within the science fiction industry. This was also the first time where people started cosplaying. In fact, I think it's the editor for L. Ron Hubbard and some other science fiction magazines dressed up in futuristic gear, and he claimed that he and his, I think, girlfriend at the time created the first cosplay. So we're starting to see a lot of elements of what we will now see continued with a lot of cons. So convention at a hotel over the course of a weekend. You have guests from the industries, you have the concept of cosplay, and eventually they will also include badges, dealer halls, and everything like that. Kind of comes from this early period. So after WorldCon was started, it was held consecutively almost every single year. It skipped a few years during World War II, but WorldCon you could kind of see as like the Olympics, where different science fiction clubs from across the United States, then later the world, will put a bid in to have their city host that convention. Normally, the hosts of the different WorldCons would be the local science fiction club of the area, or it would be the local convention organization of that area. In fact, there are some convention groups that specifically only are around to run WorldCon every time it comes back to their city. So WorldCon was really a con. It didn't have a permanent location, but it was shared by the fans. So the organizational structure will kind of change year after year. But this is the structure of how it was being held. Now, to counter WorldCon, we had WesternCon, which was started in Los Angeles. WesternCon wanted to be a specifically North American convention. Because while WorldCon could be held by any city around the world, WesternCon was the attempt to make it so it was a convention held just within the North American region. In 1949, MidwesternCon came about, and MidwesternCon was considered the first Relaxicon. So it was a con that had no programming track. It was more a con about meetups and room parties. So Relaxicons became kind of big within the science fiction community around this time. And then we had WorldCon forming the Hugo Awards. The Hugo Awards are voted on by attendees of the con, and they're now considered like the Oscars of science fiction, but it's an award that's purely voted on by the con attendees. So if you want to vote for WorldCon, you have to be an attendee for WorldCon. And around this period, the 1950s, we have the emergence of what's called folk music. Folk is a portmanteau. It's a misspelling of folk music, but it was used to describe fans of a science fiction property or medium, basically wandering into different empty panel rooms at conventions, maybe with a guitar or instrument, and start making up and riffing songs on the spot about their favorite franchise or genre. So folk music is still a big part of the science fiction convention scene. Some furry cons also include folk music, but you can kind of see the start of convention music kind of came from the folk musicians wandering around panel room to panel room and playing music on their guitar. All right, so we come to the next period. So this is where both science fiction and the comic book genre go through a different shift in their mediums. So within science fiction, retroactively now called speculative fiction, you started to see a shift between hard science fiction and epic fantasy. So this was mainly due to Michael Moorcock's New Wave magazine, which wanted to shift science fiction genre to a more subversive stance. So this is where you start seeing science fiction deal with topics like classism, racism, dystopian futures. So while the golden age of science fiction was marked by glorifying the future of mankind, that we will go out and conquer the stars, New Wave science fiction was like, no, we have a lot of problems as it is in the world. So if we don't kind of fix ourselves on the right track, we're going to wind up with a really, really grim future. And this is what we kind of get. We kind of get a grim, gritty look at science fiction around this time period. All right. On the other hand, you have J.R.R. Tolkien, who wrote The Hobbit and then the Lord of the Rings series, shifting fantasy towards high fantasy. So as opposed to the more subversive hard science fiction, you have more escapist fantasy. So this is where you kind of see the split. And while fantasy and science fiction is kind of still interchangeable around this time, and I will include fantasy with the science fiction cons just to abbreviate things, you do start seeing a split among the genres. Now, at the same time, comic books went through a period change. So the golden age of comics have ended, and now we shift to the silver age of comics. Specifically, it's DC and Marvel books that kind of make the shift to the golden age of comics. Silver Age of comics. We also have the first Japanese science fiction convention. This convention will be very, very important later on because it will have influences on the future anime convention scene. And we finally get our first comic conventions. So New York Comic Con is widely considered the first Comic Con. It's not connected to the current Repop New York Comic Con, but you kind of see a different evolution of how the comics were formed. So while science fiction cons around this time were more of fans wanting to meet other fans and inviting the industry as guests into their abode, you could see the comic conventions as being formed by comic book retailers who had a lot of merchandise and back issue comics they wanted to sell. They would normally be the ones running and organizing these cons, and they would invite guests from the industry to work and draw, sign comics, and do commissions. This became really what's considered the first artist alley. So as opposed to inviting guests as guests of honor, they would basically give comic book industry artists a table to sell their original prints, to do signings and commissions as a way to kind of get some big name recognition and draw. So you could kind of see, even though these aren't the pro cons of today, you could essentially see comic books, the comic cons, as industry run events that invite the fans into their abode, as opposed to the science fiction cons, which are fan run that invite the industry into their events. So this is why the comic cons kind of start a new trend. So you have the dealers, which kind of are a flea market style, selling old wares, old comics, old merchandise, and then you have the artist alley. And this is going to be important because there's going to be different types of artist alleys that pop up and influence each other later on. But the big con that we do want to talk about is Golden State Comic Con, which eventually becomes San Diego Comic Con, the currently in its 51st year, the oldest reigning comic convention. This is also where we kind of get the first pro cons. So Creation Con hosted some early Star Trek and fan cons, but they kind of started organizing cons in the model that you see ReedPop and other events run them today, where they would kind of host these cons as if they were industry run events. They were the ones who introduced the autograph lines that a lot of old guard science fiction fans don't like, where as opposed to the casual meetings of favorite actors and science fiction writers, you have to wait in these long lines and pay money to get autographs and whatnot. So this is why cons like Creation Con are kind of branded as cattle cons, because it seems like a money-making opportunity that strips down the personality of a lot of the fan-run cons and kind of makes things a little bit more sterile. All right, so yeah, so this is why we can look at the Comic Cons coming in from a different branch. And the science fiction conventions coming in with their own branch. So as we continue on, we're going to quickly go through what's known as the comic counterculture. So around this time period, the creator of Doctor Strange and Spider-Man, Steve Ditko, left Marvel, and likewise Jack Kirby did a few years later. Both of them left Marvel because of their frustration with Stan Lee. Around this time, Stan Lee was getting sole credit for the books and characters that Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko and other artists were designing and co-creating. So they were very frustrated with the comic book industry around this time, especially since a lot of these comic artists worked for a work for hire thing. So they weren't able to really feel the a lot of the revenue that these comic book industries were making. So naturally, a lot of these artists would go towards the underground comic scene. And in the 60s, underground comics started becoming very, very big within Austin and San Francisco. So the underground comics, you see a lot of people. So Robert Crumb, of course, made his famous Fritz the Cat around this time. You had the Texas Mafia creating Rip-Off Press. And most famously, you had the Ear Pirates, which was a subversive, quote-unquote, fan fiction of Mickey Mouse. While I would argue it's more transformative, and most people argue it's transformative. That's a panel for another time. What it did that was important was it kind of shaped how the industry dealt with fan fiction and fan writing, because before then, most people could do their own fanzines or fan comics and not have any issues with them. The Tijuana Bible, for example, are basically 8 to 10 page comics which took popular characters like Betty Boop or Humphrey Bogart or Flash Gordon and did 8 little page comics where they're normally doing adult lewd acts. So basically making adult porn comics out of popular cultures around this time, and they weren't being sued. It wasn't really until the Air Pirates ruffled Disney feathers that, okay, a lot of these companies started cramping down on the concept of these fan-made comics. However, in Japan, you had the birth of what's called Dondinshi. Dondinshi is very, very similar to the American Tijuana Bibles, where they were 10-page to 20-page comics which took a lot of anime or manga characters and would tell their own stories. Again, probably 80 to 90% of it would also be adult content as well. But because they had a very different culture, and a lot of people wanted to bond over selling their own Dondinshi, they started forming their own little meetups and conventions. And eventually, this is where we get Comic-Con, which is essentially it's not like the conventions of today. Comic-Con is actually currently still running. It runs 2 times a year, 3 times larger than San Diego Comic-Con, but it's essentially one giant artist alley where artists just sell their Dondinshi or smut comics. So it's kind of funny that you see how this con kind of evolved, and Comic-Con will introduce the anime con style of artist alley. This is important to keep in mind because anime con style artist alleys and Comic Con style artist alleys are very 2 different things. While Comic Con artist alleys are normally filled with people working in the professional industry, working on licensed properties and promoting their work, Anime Con artist alleys are filled with fan artists who are working with IPs and licenses they don't have permission to do. So they're essentially selling their own creations and fan comics and fan art. But Comic-Con will kind of be the model for what we will see with the anime cons coming up. Okay, so we're going to focus on 2 specific franchise fandoms that had a very big role in the convention scene. The first of all is Star Trek convention, because the Star Trek fandom had a very big impact on the convention scene. So if we want to really start it, Star Trek was essentially first announced at a convention. Gene Roddenberry, the creator of Star Trek, first announced it at WorldCon, and within a year, the term Trekkie was coined. So the Star Trek fandom grew really, really rapidly and fast around this time. So just as a good example, the first Star Trek convention, Star Trek Lives, was attended by 3,000 attendees the first year. That's really, really impressive because even most PonyCons don't hit the 3,000 attendee mark. The second year, it was already at 6,000 attendees. And then by the third year, it was 15,000 attendees. So crowded that 6,000 more people had to be turned away. So you started to see Star Trek cons becoming really, really big. And because this is a time period when newscast journalism and newspapers and a lot of different mediums could report on the news now, you start to see a lot of focus on the Star Trek cons. And while the Jane Austen fandom and the Sherlock Holmes fandom, you could say, were also equally just as radical and fanatical and crazy as fans, the fact that Star Trek came about in the time period where we had broadcast news and television, it got a big blunt of the attention. And because of this, a lot of stereotypes that we associate with hardcore fandoms, geek culture, nerd culture, came about because of Star Trek. And also unfairly, Star Trek also got a lot of blame for the stuff. So things that Star Trek cons popularized, the concept of cosplay, like we were saying, cosplay has existed from then on, but having news stations and seeing pictures of a convention full of people dressed up in Starfleet gear painted a really specific picture for the culture around this time. So this is where a lot of people associate cosplay with nerd culture. Again, slashing and shipping. So shipping, which is taking two characters, normally the same gender, who are not romantically in a relationship with each other in the canonical property, but are in fan fiction, became big around this time. So you start to see a lot of Spock and Kirk slash fiction and fanzines. So shipping became really, really popular around this time. So Star Trek didn't start it, but it definitely popularized it, and a lot of the concepts we got came from this period. So quickly going to go through the next period. So we have the Bronze Age of comics and what's known as kind of the Dark Age of animation and cartoons. This is the where Hanna-Barbera kind of started. Oh yeah, someone in the chat said the Star Trek, one of Star Trek fix did coin the term Mary Sue. So quickly just going through this period, this is where comics shifted from being more wholesome and clean-hearted and run by the Comics Code Authority to tackling issues like drugs, racism, sexism, classism. And because of this, the Comic Code Authority started losing traction as being a regulating authority. But this is also where people started to see what's considered more the downfall of comics, because you started seeing a lot more unnecessarily gruesome death. Around the same time, the Hollywood system completely changed when Jaws and Star Wars were released in theaters. So a lot of this time we had what's called a studio system, where films were seen as big art house projects where they'll run in theaters and probably make back their money over time. The concept that films could make money within a year was really, really big news to them. And the fact that Jaws and Star Wars were something that kids and adults could go to a theater during the summer and watch over and over and over and over again gave rise to the shift where we started moving more towards blockbuster cinemas, where people wanted to see these big action pictures that could draw in a lot of money. So the film industry started shifting more towards a profit incentive model as opposed to more artsy driven creator projects. So in this culture, we kind of started to see more science fiction cons rebranding themselves as general cons. So science fiction used to be the end all definition for all pop culture. So science fiction cons will also include fans of superhero comics, fans of anime, fans of manga, fans of Western cartoon shows. But as the definition of science fiction started becoming more niche in the public consciousness, a lot of science fiction cons wanted to rebrand themselves as general conventions. So this is where we started seeing a shift. Even though science fiction cons were always the mainstream convention, the multimedia, the multi-genre convention, this is where we started seeing a shift where science fiction cons started rebranding themselves as general multimedia conventions. And we started seeing a split with cons who want to remain purely sci-fi. So hard sci-fi cons started taking a split from there. Around the same time, we started seeing Star Trek cons start rebranding themselves as general fandom cons, so welcoming different fandoms as well. Around this time, we had the term Gopher coins, which is a short term for con volunteer, because they would go and fetch something. And we also started to see con security forces start forming around this time. So, for example, if you guys ever been to BabsCon, you'll know that that's by Flare. And we started seeing a lot of groups like Flare form around this time. All right. So quickly, let's go through the 80s. So we're going to have a period where comics were finally considered an art form. So we had a we had three important works come out the same year in 1985. So we had Mouse, Dark Knight Returns, and Watchmen, and these shifted the comics industry, kind of turning it on its head because within the United States, comics were never really considered a true art form. They were always considered pulp. They were always considered childish. But these works, specifically Mouse and Watchmen, showed what the comic format could do and elevated the comics form to be considered an art form. Alan Moore specifically wrote Watchmen as a critique on the superhero genre, hoping to end it and bring forth a new innovation and revolution within the comic book industry. Unfortunately, it had the opposite effect and ushered in what's called the dark age of comics. But so likewise, we started to see, because comics were finally recognized as an art form, comics were starting to win awards that they normally wouldn't win. So Watchmen won the Hugo Award, and Neil Gaiman's Sandman won the World Fantasy Awards. And because of these comic books winning awards that were meant for literature, a lot of these awards would the next year change the rules so a comic could not be nominated in their categories again. So because of this, the comics industry was like, why not just make our own awards show? And like how Hugo Awards were born within the WorldCon scene, you had San Diego Comic-Con creating the Kirby Awards to honor art within comics. So we had Kirby Awards. Eventually, the Kirby Awards, due to inside fighting, split into the Eisner Awards, which are still being held at San Diego Comic-Con, and the Harvey Awards, which are held at Baltimore Comic-Con, and then currently now at New York Comic-Con. So like I was saying, cons are shifting to multimedia, multi-genre cons. So you started seeing this with some of the Comic Cons. WonderCon still tried to remain purely a comic specific con, but then you had Dragon Con. Dragon Con was founded as a science fiction con, but quickly shifted to be a multi-genre con, and Dragon Con was first promoted at WorldCon. So just talking about Watchmen, if you guys want to learn more about the influence and legacy Watchmen had on the industry, I have a thread that's pinned to my Twitter account called The Shadow of Watchmen, which talks a little bit about this. All right, so let's quickly go forward. We're going to have, so like I said, comics entered a dark age. What's considered a dark age. This also was where the comics crash and boom, which will be mentioned in the chapter, emerge. But what American comics were doing were actually influencing manga in Japan, like Akira. And then Akira would make its way back to America and start influencing the Dark Age comics, like Ninja Turtles, Daredevil, and Hellboy, which would be inspired by the Western manga. Likewise, you had Disney films inspiring the works of Tezuka and Miyazaki. And then likewise, the Miyazaki and Studio Ghibli films coming back to America and influencing Disney. Now, again, this Disney was also during it going through a dark, like almost every single industry was going through a dark age around this time. The television cartoon industry, the comic book industry, the Disney industry were all going through their own dark ages. In fact, Disney was very, very close to shutting down shop and ending the animation wing of its studio. But after the success of Who Framed Roger Rabbit, and then partly modeling itself on Broadway musicals and being inspired by a lot of the works of Miyazaki, Disney started creating new works, starting with Little Mermaid and Beauty and the Beast, Lion King, and Aladdin, which started what's now known as the Disney Renaissance. Same time, a lot of cartoon animators who grew up and loved the golden age of cartooning. So the Looney Tune and Disney cartoons of the 40s and 50s, which were lively and animated, they did not like what was going on now. We had things like He-Man, G.I. Joe, Hanna-Barbera style cartoons that were very, very stiff and not lively. And the fact that cartoons should be cartoony and animation should be animated was something that they really wanted to go back to. So you had animators like John Kay, inspired by the golden age of animation, try to create shows in such a manner, and you start to see more creator-driven, unique style, traditional animated shows emerge around this time, starting what's known as the television cartoon renaissance. So Cartoon Network, Nickelodeon, Toon Disney all had fantastic shows around this time. Likewise, what Watchmen did was attempting to do with the comic book industry. Another creator in Japan noticed the anime industry also falling into a similar trap, like how comics were being dominated by superhero genre. Anime around this time was dominated by the mecha suit and space opera genre, and one creator really wanted to subvert this, so he basically made Evangelion, which was supposed to be anime's equivalent to Watchmen, to shift the genre. But like Watchmen, it had the opposite effect, where it's subverted the animation industry to like almost a decade of Eva clones. All right, so anime. So this is the same time period where we started getting a new round of dubs. So around this time period, there was really no specific term for animation from Japan. It was called Japanimation, and Japanimation was really only tested in markets on the West Coast and in Hawaii. So since a lot of these conventions, science fiction conventions, were held on the West Coast, they were the ones who would bring this Japanimation over to the room parties and cons and share it with con goers. So you started seeing a lot of room parties form around the love of anime. So anime fans realized, hey, wait, we are getting big enough. Why don't we just start our own conventions? Because these anime room parties were overflowing. So they're like, we could do our own room parties. So in 1990, you had ACON, which is currently the longest running and what's believed to be the oldest anime convention formed. Some claim it's Yamato-Con, which was founded about a decade earlier, but again, if we're looking at definition of conventions, Yamato-Con was a one-day meetup. Anime A-Con was more of a weekend event in the same model of conventions. So you have anime cons, which were formed by fans who are running room parties at science fiction cons, and then they were taking elements of comic kit and adding it to their thing. So what anime cons introduced to America was the anime style of running the artist alley. So as opposed to professional industry folks, these were all fan-made comics. Cosplay contests and masquerade balls became really, really big around this time. This is around the time cosplay was termed. In fact, cosplay was coined at a WorldCon event. And as opposed to the folk music you'll see at early science fiction cons, anime cons introduced more Japanese-inspired concerts and raves to the scene. All right, so we could kind of see how both, so if we look at the room parties from the science fiction line, we can see the room parties influencing both the anime cons and then what we'll talk about next, the furry cons. So, like with the anime cons, the furry cons, they specifically didn't have a name for themselves at first. Anthropomorphic culture has been something that was widely loved and appreciated in the past. Widely loved and appreciated in the past. So you had a lot of people still liking things like, we like Looney Tunes. They would like characters who are half human, half animal. So why is it that they were liking this specific thing? So there was not really a term for it, but they knew they were just fans of anthropomorphic animals. So one of the first room parties for these groups of fans was a con at WesternCon. And then you also had a room party happening at San Diego Comic-Con. And then the next year, they finally decided to officially coin the term furry and use the term furry for these room parties. So you started getting the start of furry room parties. One room party at WesternCon became so popular, the host of that room party went on to create the first furry convention, Conference. And Conference, as opposed to the anime cons, which also evolved from science fiction room parties, they did adopt a lot of stuff from the Japanese style of cons. But Conference and the later furry cons specifically modeled themselves off of science fiction convention themes and tropes. So you had the model of having the reduced room rates, having a programming track, having the party rooms. In fact, you see that furry cons still continue the tradition of what science fiction cons used to do. So science fiction cons normally have a bulletin board in the lobby where you could post your room party and meet up information there. Furry cons still have that similar room party board and carried it over to themselves. In fact, I guess we'll talk about it when we talk about ponies. You can see that BabsCon is actually one of the few pony conventions influenced by the science fiction con scene because they actually imported that room party bulletin board into their convention lobby as well. So you can kind of see where the DNA of all these cons kind of come from. So furry cons started becoming popular to the point that WorldCon started offering their own furry lounge and specific furry track. While the first furry con was founded before the first anime cons, it was the bulk of furry cons being founded after the downfall of Conference that you started seeing a boom in furry conventions, specifically Anthrocon and Midwest Fur Fest, which were at one point in time both the largest furry convention. Now, the next few chapters quickly go over this. So all you need to know about the 90s is from the science fiction con scene. This is where Wizard Entertainment, which used to run Wizard Magazine, bought Chicago Comic Con and rebranded it as WorldCon Chicago. So outside of Creative Con, this is now where the next group of organizers who want to run the cons will start trying to form their own conventions. All right, and in the next chapters, I'm going to quickly just go over, but basically it covers a lot of in-betweens that are necessary for explaining how the convention scene end up evolving. So chapter 14, I cover the award scene. This is very important within the why conventions start becoming industry staples. Chapter 15 will cover the new medium. So I'm covering webcomics, the internet, video games, and visual novels. So things that started forming their own conventions or influence conventions. So, for example, webcomics, you had Penny Arcade, which will eventually create Penny Arcade Expo, now known as PAX. Visual novels were kind of born from the Comic Cat scene. And of course, video games, this is the era where you have E3, which was a consumer trade show, now trying to model itself as a convention. So fan fiction is the state of fan fiction. So you had online websites dedicated to fandoms and publishing fan fiction, a lot of legal issues. Likewise, you also had a lot of comic artists like Jack Kirby and the creators of Superman trying to sue the comic book industries for royalties they should be earning on their comics they created. And then you had a period from about 2004 to 2010 called it's called the recession. I call it the Great Recession in this case, because this is a period where you start seeing more cookie cutter, by the numbers franchise medium being pumped out across the board. So within the cinema scene, you start to see big, flashy, CGI-filled movies like Michael Bay's Transformers. In animation, you start seeing a cruder shift from traditional animation of the Renaissance period to more crude flash animation, which is emphasized by shows like Family Guy and Johnny Test. And of course, within the literature scene, you had a shift to more Da Vinci Code, Twilight style stuff. So this is a period where conventions kind of have been given some type of stereotypical branding within media. It was seen as something that was dorky, something that was geeky, something that was not made for the public. So what really changed? We had Robert Downey Jr. appearing at San Diego Comic-Con, a big Hollywood actor appearing at a convention, which kind of shifted the attention of the public. A big Hollywood actor is at a convention that's supposed to be for geeks and dorks, and we could actually attend these cons and meet some Hollywood actors. That became kind of a big shift. Of course, Robert Downey Jr. was there to promote Iron Man, which would be the first to launch the MCU. Around this time, Dark Knight became recognized within the film industry for actually lifting the superhero genre to a more artistic merit. And this was coincided with a period where you started seeing a big spike in conventions. Conventions started beforehand. You could almost buy a ticket to San Diego Comic-Con the day of and just walk up, buy a ticket, and go to a con. After this, tickets for San Diego Comic-Con would just be selling out, and it became like near impossible, like concert tickets for San Diego Comic-Con. This is where people started taking notice that cons were now another potential revenue source for money. So you had Wizard Entertainment now buying conventions again. Reed Pop, which used to just host trade shows, was now shifting to running fan run cons. They would buy cons like New York Comic Con, PAX, and Emerald City, or create your own con like C2E2. So geek culture became really, really big and popular around the time. Geek was chic. It was seen as popular. Big Bang Theory, shows that were used to be just held within the specific fandoms, like the Game of Thrones, was now seeing a wider audience because of its television adaptation. People who were in geek culture were becoming popular, like Kevin Smith, Josh Whedon, and Harmon. And of course, people wanted to start capitalizing on this with Funko Pop and Loot Crates. And with that, I'm going to shift over to the Brony history side and bring on my my friend Simo, who does the Brony history panel with me. So, all right, Simo, we are ready. I'm just going to wait for him to be there. Hello, are you there?
He's not. He needs to go ahead and try and rejoin.
Oh, okay, rejoin. Okay, well, I will start talking, and I will continue talking until he joins back. But basically, I'm just going to quickly cover the basic history portion of the Brony fandom, and then we're going to move down to breaking it up. Hey, there you are.
I'm here. Hold up, I got to pause the stream because now I'm hearing two of myself and everything.
Right, no worries.
There we go.
All right. If you guys don't know,
everybody.
Simo and I, we are co-hosts of the Zootopia Minute podcast, and at different conventions, we do a panel called Brony Fandom History. And I think this was a good time for me to bring him on, and we will talk about kind of the history that we go through. So, Simo, I guess, what would you like to start on, I guess, with the Brony history portion?
Well, let's see. For anyone who's joined us at conventions, we do a separate panel on this sometimes, just covering the history of the Brony fandom. Is this all those same slides, Chuck, or is this different? Yeah,
the same slides. Yep.
Cool. All right. We can probably just start walking through the eras, I suppose. Okay.
So, like I was saying, with any history, it's very, very hard to coin different eras. So I've divided independently, without looking at other, because I know there's been academic research on bronies. I want to do my own thing. I was able to break down the Brony fandom era into 5 specific periods, covering spans of about 2 to 3 years, and each of them are based on where the fans seem to be gathering, what medium of expression was popular around the time, and the attitude of the culture. So the first era, I used to call the Equestria Daily era. I'm now just going to rebrand as the News era. This was when bronies started becoming very, very popular. I guess you guys all know the story. One guy wrote an article kind of attacking Lauren Faust, much beloved by us millennials for having a hand in the animation renaissance. And a lot of the fans, specifically on 4chan, wanted to defend her. So a lot of fans specifically wanted to watch My Little Pony to give Lauren Faust the support, and found out, hey, it's actually really, really good. And the fans started bonding over little things like, hey, there's a derp-eyed pony in the background. Let's adopt her as our mascot. We'll call her Derpy. Hey, and of course the famous term brony was coined on 4chan as well as a portmanteau of pony bro.
Wait, that's what that means? No
Yes.
way.
No.
Wow, I never knew that. No, but pretty fascinating stuff. If anyone's ever heard of the Streisand effect, what happened here is basically an extreme example of that, where someone's attempt to prevent something from getting attention or to deride something actually has the opposite of the intended effect. So that this negative article that was written about the MLP series actually resulted in everyone going to check it out. And one thing led to another, and here we are.
Yeah. So like I was saying, I kind of divide each era based on where the fans are grouping to and what was the dominating center hub of the fandom. And around this time, just because Equestria Daily was really the first news site, it became it started becoming the hub to attract a lot of fans. So fans who were new to the show, and this was in a time where ponies was not as well talked about. So any little details we get, any new episodes, any interviews, any new merchandise would all be gathered on this. And because of this, Equestria Daily were also posting fan fiction and fan art, because fan art and fan fiction are visual mediums that you could read online on like a website like this. These were becoming the central creative elements of the fandom around this time, and thus the quote-unquote horse famous fandom celebrities of this time period were the fan fiction writers and the artists. And I guess the culture of a lot of the fan fiction art and stories were based on trying to explain why you like pony, but in an ironic way. So I guess, Simo, you might remember, but back when the fandom kind of started, it was kind of hard to explain to your friends and family why you like ponies. So to kind of explain off, people would say, oh, I like it ironically, or it's kind of like a joke. And to justify this, they would try to mash up ponies, which are cute, happy, fun-loving cartoon show for kids, with things that are the exact opposite. So more grim, dark, adult-themed stuff. So you would have things like Fall Equestria, Rainbow Factory, Cupcakes, that dealt with more crude, opposing humor. Then you would have things like Milo Dashi, what would deal with more sentimental stuff. And then things like Apple Move, which put adult content within a pony franchise. So to like it ironically, you have to mash it with something that's its polar opposite.
Right, yeah. Although you can see that as time has moved on, we've shifted away from this, and you'll be covering that later on. But yeah, I definitely remember there's a big difference between when I first started getting into this and trying to explain that to my friends and especially my parents, and nowadays, like, it's just another thing I do, and it's no big deal, right? I mean, I've been staffing Everfree for years, and I run it now, so it's like, oh yeah, that's just a thing he does. You know, no big deal.
Your parents are great.
Yeah,
so
it's become less novel, I guess.
So I would say the shift in the end of the Equestria Daily era was when a group called Everfree was formed, and they wanted to introduce a new concept, basically hosting like podcasts and music onto a platform. And this was a time period where you started seeing a lot more audio-based radio-style podcasts and groups come up, like Ponyville Live, BerryTube, Everfree Radio, Everfree Network, Celestia Radio. And this shift to the next period where fans will now flock to more audio-based things. So this is where podcasters and musicians now become the center point of the fandom, and podcasters and musicians are now really the horse famous celebrities of this era because it's audio-based things that are becoming popular. Thus, I term this period the audio or the radio era, because this is where the fandom was kind of forming around. This is where you start seeing a lot of famous brony musicians really get big jumps in their name. So, of course, you had the Discord song and Anthropology song becoming very popular around this time. You had musicians like Black Griffin, Mando Pony, Living Tombstone becoming big around this time. And this is where we also start seeing a shift in the art that shifted away from the irony of liking ponies to embracing the cringe, which was pony. So it was more embracing the cringe of the fandom. So you start seeing a lot more self-aware artwork and stories, self-aware posts. Memes started becoming really big and popular around this time. And you have a lot of entertainment that is more based around self-awareness or cringe.
Oh, yes. And I think, yeah, if anyone remembers Everfree Network, it was Everfree Radio at the first time when it was founded. And I definitely remember some of those early conventions, seeing them around doing live streams at the time. Actually, it's interesting, come to think, that back during the earliest conventions that we had, like the first Everfree, the first BronyCons, stuff like that, and we had things like PVL and Everfree Network that were doing these streaming type things. And now we're at a convention that is nothing but a live stream, right? And a Discord chat. Yeah. It's interesting how things have evolved. And I think that kind of highlights how technology really helps fans connect. The internet definitely made everything take off, which I believe you went over earlier in this panel too, how the internet had a huge impact on this kind of thing. So
I am wondering though, like because you do work for Everfree Northwest,
yeah,
was there an issue with having Everfree Network having the name Everfree and your con having the name Everfree?
I don't think so. I think most people were able to tell the difference. And by the way, during that first year, they were still called Everfree Radio. It was Everfree Radio first, and then they changed to network later on.
I just realized network could be abbreviated as NW as well.
NW, right? Everfree NW, right? Yeah, but there's no F, right?
Everfree Northwest. That's why I always assumed. I used to think they were connected at first, but
yeah. Well, people forget. That's the funny thing now is when I think Everfree, I usually think of the con. Like that's just what that word means to me. But no, both Everfree Network and Everfree Northwest took that name from the Everfree Forest outside of Ponyville. It's an actual thing from the show, but I associated it so much with the convention now that I've almost forgotten about that. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And I guess we do want to mention this is the period where Unicon took place, and it's going to be very important when it leads on to the next chapter of the book. But we're just going to quickly mention Unicon. You guys probably know what Unicon is. It was like the DashCon of PonyCon. It shifted the industry. Around this time, there was a lot of infighting because Everfree Network did not actually make too many friends within the community around this time, because around this time, a lot of the sharing of con panels used to be shared around the different networks and radio groups. And then they started seeing Everfree slowly encroaching on being the exclusive streaming partner for a lot of these conventions. So Everfree, there's a lot of con infighting around this time. We joked that there was a pony Illuminati that was fighting with each other. But
well, I mean, there is.
Yeah, there still is. But the fact that the Unicon, which could have potentially been the end of the Brony convention scene as we know it, the fact that the fandom united around this, put aside their differences and raise money to help pay for the guests to at least be competent, get their travel and hotel covered, was a big changing point, and not just within the pony fandom. The reason why ponies and Trekkies do get a big influence in this book is because the bronies popularized the concept of what's called the VIPR. So if you guys don't know how most cons around this time are run, a lot of cons would bring on guests of honor, and sometimes they'll be overworked. They'll be forced to do a lot of signings. They'll be herded like cattle through signings panels. They'll be so stressed out that they might not even want to come to the con next year. And the con's like, well, we're big enough. We could grab a different guest. Doesn't matter. Within the pony fandom, Purple Tinker, the founder of BronyCon, brought this up specifically. There's a very small pool of people to pull from. So if we piss off one guest, then they are going to blab to their other guests, and oh no, we can't have anyone to pull from anymore. So to make sure that the guests want to return to the cons, they have to be treated with more respect and not stressed out. So VIP relationship was created. And after this point, almost every single con, furry con, anime cons, comic cons, shifted to adopting, or at least adopting their green room or guest relation department to being in a similar model to how PonyCons had VIPR.
By the way, I just want to give a quick shout out here to some of the VIPs from the show and from IDW that agreed to come do programming for PonyFest Online. Considering how unorthodox it is to do something like this online. They've been excellent sports, and everyone watching the stream should definitely stick around to see some of those events later.
There's a lot of fun panels coming up. But we are running short on time on my panel, so we're going to quickly cover the rest of the Brony stuff. And well,
go!
You gave me like an extra half hour for this panel, and we're still not even doing everything.
Right. By the way, did you want to do audience Q&A?
I might be able to.
Okay, I'm going to open up the main stage questions channel in the panels category on Discord, guys. If you have questions, go ahead and let us know in there. I'm going to go ahead and unlock
I guess
that
Simil,
now.
you could select some questions that might be good for me to cover later on. But we're going to quickly go to the next period. So I would say that the Everfree network or the radio era ended when BronyCon was basically said, you know what, we could handle our own streaming. We don't need Everfree to help with our streaming anymore. So Everfree's dominance kind of fell. And in the next era, I call the convention era, because this is now where fans, they've been friends with, they had online friends, friends around the world for such a long time. They really wanted to meet up in person. And after Unicon collapsed, the pony cons, they started weeding out the smaller cons, merchant cons, to focus on a few select strong regional conventions. So now with the convention scene solidified, people start becoming safer to attend these conventions, with BronyCon being, of course, the big one that was the one everyone needed to join. So I call this the convention era because this is where fans now were centered around meeting in person. And because of this, the people who were fans were excited to meet in person were the YouTube personalities. So animators, reviewers, and content creators on YouTube started becoming the horse famous celebrities around this time. And also, this is where the term horse famous was really starting to take hold as a serious term, not as an ironic term at all. So the concept of meeting horse famous people online in person was really, really big. So you now have a shift in celebrities to more the online content personalities. And this was also around the time where I would say a lot of the content that was created was now aimed towards trying to make a profession or career out of ponies. So you had a lot of musicians trying to make back money by going to cons and doing concerts by selling CDs and merchandise. You started seeing YouTube content creators now making ad revenue off their videos. You had artists at cons becoming bigger and bigger dealers to the point that they could actually make a full-time income selling at cons, like myself. You had people shifting to try to work within the comic book industry, sometimes getting their start within working with IDW and working on the Pony comics before branching out. And you had people trying to take it and use it to be resume building projects. So, for example, you had Double Rainbow made around this time, which was supposed to be like a final class project.
What a throwback.
You had Fighting is Magic, another attempt to make something that could be presented as like a resume style thing. So you had a lot of people trying to make money on the fandom, and not in a bad way, but they're like, oh, there's actually interest enough that we could actually sustain a living based off content we create. And this is where you see a lot of creative new stuff come around this time. So you have memes like M.A. Larson really was well accepted by the fandom around this time. And of course, you had fantastic creations like Ship Fic Folder Game, which a lot of creative stuff around this time. Simul, any comments on this time period?
I just remember how funny it was when that Bob's Burgers episode came out with the parody there. That was very topical at the time. That was actually, I guess, at that kind of peak of when the mainstream media was kind of catching on and kind of poking fun at the fandom.
And I like how accurately they created the Baltimore Convention Center, even with the blue.
The ceiling. Yeah, the ceiling looks the same and everything. It has that same pattern. If anyone ever went to BronyCon, the ceiling in the vendor hall looks a lot like that. It's maybe a little more white, less brown, but yeah.
I'm also upset no brony has ever tried to do an Equestronauts cosplay at PonyCon. I mean, these are like the perfect cosplay material. But
yeah, no kidding.
Anyways.
All right, I think we should keep on moving.
All right. So I would say the downfall of the con scene was when BronyCon, it hit its peak, and then all of a sudden there was a noticeable decline in attendance over the years. And this was also the same time period where the quote-unquote BronyCon leaks, where a lot of cons were having a lot of leak issues behind the scene, and a lot of these leaks were being posted on drama sites, which shifted to the next period, which I like to call the drama era, where people were wanting to see these quote-unquote horse famous celebrities being taken down. And now we had a shift to people wanting to get a lot of drama within the fandom, and like Twitter drama, online drama became really, really big. I wouldn't say Horse News was the center of it, but Horse News was one of the groups that was posting a lot of this drama and fueling it. So we had this drama period which lasted for about 2 years. Anything you want to say about this before I quickly move on?
Nothing specific.
Okay. Let me see. All right.
Just trying to make more time for questions.
Yeah, so the drama era, I said, ended when we realized, wait, season 9 is going to be a last era. And the last era, I would say, is kind of like the nostalgia era. This is the period where people were like, oh no, the fandom is ending. Let's embrace everything that we loved. Let's move away, because also the drama that was causing the fandom hurt the fandom itself, because the fandom was pretty good with calling out bad actors with its scene, but because of this, the public was seeing that the fandom was calling out so many bad actors. So like, oh wait, is the fandom really attracting that many people? And because of that, the drama fueled part of the fandom really shot itself in the foot. Mm-hmm. So drama started downgrading. So people started becoming more nostalgic as the show started ending. And that becomes the last era of the fandom, which is kind of sprinkled throughout the last few chapters of the book.
By the way, for those that think the fandom is dying, go ahead and take a look at the view count on this stream. Go ahead and take a look at how many people we have in our Discord server right now for this event that you guys have come out here for. Massive thanks to everyone for showing up.
Thank you very much,
We have
guys.
over 3,500 people in our Discord server right now, so give yourselves a round of applause. Show the world how dead this fandom really is. All 3,500 of you showing up to this.
Right. Ooh, 15 minutes. So this might not be enough time for questions. So I'm going to quickly just go through I really wish I had enough time. All right. So Unicon, DashCon, these things kind of changed the face of the con scene. So you started seeing a emergence of pro cons versus fan cons. So fan run cons were starting to seem more unstable because you started seeing things like, DashCon happening. Oh, fan volunteers cannot run cons well. So this is where pro cons started taking the scene. So you started seeing pro cons like Creation Entertainment, Wizard World, and Forma Repop Left Field Media buying up existing fan run cons and rebranding it as a Wizard World Con or Fan Expo Con, to the point that they were actually kind of mean and try to push out other fan run cons in the same period. So for example, Wizard World tried to hold a con the same weekend as Heroes Con, and the comic book talent was so upset they boycotted Wizard World for that year. Fan Expo bought Dallas Comic Con, rebranded as Fan Expo Dallas, and held it the same weekend as A-Con. So you had a lot of pro cons and fan cons kind of really fighting each other, while cons that normally did well as one specific convention started trying to rapidly branch out and expand. Sometimes it worked, like PAX cons around the United States worked well, but Otakon, when it tried to do Otakon Vegas, that didn't work well. AwesomeCon tried to make a bunch of awesome cons, that didn't really work well. And this is also where the furry fandom started becoming more embraced. Furries weren't seen as weird anymore. They were seen as more open public. They were charitable people who were giving back to the community. So furry cons were now finally being attended by a lot of people. And you started seeing a boom of attendance in furry cons. Furry cons are finally like Anthrocon and Midwest Fur Fest finally hitting 7-8K in attendance for the first time, which really changed the scene because furry cons had to play catch up because they isolated themselves for about 10 years from the convention scene. They didn't really bring on con volunteers from other cons. They were really way behind in like their registration system, badge system, everything like that. So furry cons had to play a lot of catch up. Then we come to the next period, the gatekeepers. Specifically, I'd like to use Ancillary Justice, which is a book that won a lot of awards. It was seen as PC, SJW, leftist, liberal by a lot of the more conservative faction of the science fiction community. So the conservative science fiction community fans wanted to have a more conservative block voting for the Hugo Awards at the WorldCon. So they created what was called the Sad Puppies Awards, where they would specifically nominate right-wing or conservative writers and artists in different categories and try to do block voting to vote these people to win the award. It didn't really work. But the same era of the Sad Puppies coming out was the same period, was the same decade where Gamergate, Comicgate, Me Too started happening. So you had a lot of call-out culture, cancel culture. So this affected cons in a lot of ways. So for example, one of Dragon Con's co-founder, convicted of pedophilia, around this time he owned 1/3 of Dragon Con. So there's a lot of people trying to boycott Dragon Con. So it had to shift where they bought him out of the rest of his ownership of Dragon Con. You had this affect a convention attendees where they wanted to cancel attendees who or guests who were seen as problematic. So Vic Mignola, who was a big voice actor within the anime community doing a lot of anime con, was seen as being banned at a lot of anime cons with the Kick Vic movement. Around the same time, the furry fandom was having an issue with Nazis in their mix. Furries are normally, just like the Brony fandom, normally more liberal on the spectrum, a little bit more left. And they were having issues with some cons, like the Rocky Mountain Fur Con being run by people who, even if they were not right wing or alt-right, they still had, I guess, a lot of problematic expressions and online content. So there was a shift with the fandom uniting as a whole, trying to call out and cancel Rocky Mountain Fur Con. And the mixed corgi events, which actually started running PonyCons like Winnie City and Ponyville Ciderfest, started shifting to fill the void of the furry cons that were disappearing. So you had Denver replacing Rocky Mountain Fur Con as the Colorado local con, and then they also created Painted Desert Fur Con, which was supposed to be an alternative to Arizona Fur Con, which was run by anime con people. and not seen as really a true furry con. And you start seeing a lot of cons like furry cons booming around this time. The only problem is, unlike BronyCons, which kind of consolidated, the furry cons are rapidly expanding. So you had a lot of new cons that were also just as rocky as Unicon. And of course, San Diego Comic-Con, Salt Lake City had that lawsuit issue. So final period. So this is the final chapter of the book. This was originally where I was going to end the book. Basically, 80 years of WorldCon, 50 years of San Diego Comic-Con, the final BronyCon. This is also where the Infinity War saga ended, 10 years of the MCU, perfect place to end on. Originally, this is where I was going to end the book. I was going to wrap it up, but then we had something called the coronavirus, which aptly still fits in the endgame chapter of the book. So the irony of the coronavirus is it brought about a new kind of depression. The economic state of the country is kind of low, and a lot of cons are being canceled. A lot of cons are small fan-run cons that could not survive a year of cancellation. So a lot of smaller cons, because they couldn't be run this year, are now having to close up forever. Some cons were lucky enough they were able to postpone to later in the year, but because of that, they're now being conflicted with a lot of other cons also being postponed in the year. And most cons had to wait till next year. So a lot of cons are being postponed till the year after that. So the irony that the culture of that kind of gave birth to the first conventions, the Great Depression, the end of the World War I, and the Spanish flu, gave birth, I would theorize, to why fans started wanting to gather and meet up at cons, kind of ended with another pandemic and a depression. So we're in this period now. This is a brand new period. We don't know how it's going to go. It's only been 1 month into the shutdown, with a lot of states being shut down because of this and a lot of cons being canceled. So we don't know where this is it, but it's kind of coincidental that it all comes down after all this period. And if I had more time, I would cover it, but that kind of concludes the presentation portion of my panel. You can follow more of my convention history at Transformative or Con History on Twitter. And you can email me at alexander@jg.edu because I am still looking for people to interview. If you are an old guard science fiction con person, if you've been doing cons for a long time, if you run cons, if you have old con books, old badges, old photos that you want to send me, I would love to use them for the book. So please send me as much as you can. And with that, thank you for joining for the presentation portion of my panel. And I will go to answering Q&A until they kick me off. Oh, wow. I only have 5 minutes left.
Yeah. Excellent presentation there. I think my favorite part is your voice getting slowly faster and faster as you realize we're running out of time.
How did I run out of time? I had 30 minutes more than my normal panel.
Well, doing our best. So, guys, thank you for watching. What I think the best thing we're gonna do, the way to make.
Do you have any good questions I could answer? Like maybe.
Yeah, let me very quickly grab some good ones from here.
All right.
And then if you want, you can probably answer them in the chat afterwards, just because we're not going to be able to get through all these guys. So I do apologize for that. One person, so Lego Liam 1235 asks, why do you think that there are so many PonyCons around the world?
So PonyCons were very, very unique. I think. Like I said, it's really weird because Harry Potter fandom, Steven Universe fandom, I would argue was bigger, but we PonyCons had more cons. I think it was because it was the same isolation that the Trekkies and the furries experience, where they could only meet online, and if they met up in public, they would be kind of shamed or made fun of. Unlike more popular mediums like Harry Potter and Star Wars fans, which you could wear Star Wars shirt or Harry Potter shirt, and people think it's cool. Bronies were first initially made fun of, so the only time they could really meet in person, wear the shirts they want, make the cosplays they want, and actually, be seen was with like-minded peers. This is why I think the PonyCons really, really exploded.
Yeah. Let's see. Got another one. With the rise of social media, this is from Twinny. With the rise of social media and technology, do you think that the general in-person convention scene will still hold strong in relevancy in the next few years? I
was wondering that. I was kind of predicting that in the future. I think with the rise of virtual reality and like Second Life style things, I really pictured like a situation like in Ready Player One, where we could actually start attending virtual cons, where we could look exactly like we want in our avatars and interact with people in a virtual landscape. And I think I was predicting this would take a while to happen, but because of the coronavirus basically making a lot of these cons online, we have virtual artist alleys, we have virtual panels like what you're listening to right now being done online, not just with the Brony fandom. Furries and comic folks are doing the same thing right now. I think that the coronavirus is hastening the movement towards more online conventions.
Right. Okay, I'm going to make this the last one we're going to answer on air, and then Chaco is going to do... try and answer some.
Yeah, I'll answer them in the Discord server.
All right. So this one I thought was really cool, actually. Do you think that the brony fandom, this is from Stargazer DC, is it possible that without the internet, the brony fandom would have still existed? Are we only here because of the conditions, right place at the right time, etc.?
I'm wondering that too, because so if we look at the Star Trek fandom and actually like Sherlock Holmes fandom, for example, they were able to what we have now, we have like forums where we could talk to each other and stuff. The early version of forums were essentially the fanzines of the past. That's how Star Trek fans interact with each other. The only difference was the Star Trek fans were purely born out of the convention scene. Star Trek was first announced at a science fiction convention, and this is where the fans kind of gathered. So unless people started gathering, I think without the internet, I think bronies would probably met up within the anime con or furry con scenes, and then we would have evolved from anime cons or furry cons. But because of the internet, we were able to start off independently and create our own cons first, unlike Trekkies that had to evolve from science fiction cons first.
All right, cool. Okay, so I think that's going to wrap it up for the panel time that we have. Big thanks to everyone for attending. Up next is Riff Ponies. So, Chaco, I'll let you go ahead and give a salutation goodbye, and we'll move on to the next panel.
All right. Thank you very much, guys. If you guys want to know more about my thing, just follow me on Twitter at TransformArtive. I'm also on Twitter at Con History, where I'll be posting updates about my Con History book. And again, if you want to contribute, if you want to learn more, if you have questions about the book, email me at alexander@jhu.edu. I could use your input. If you have any suggestions, any clarifications, any history you want to contribute, that'll be great. Thank you very much.
All right. Enjoy the rest of PonyFest Online. Up next is Riff Ponies.